When Congressman Mike Quigley corners FBI Director Kash Patel with a single, unyielding question, a massive national narrative begins to completely unravel live on camera. Imagine being legally mandated to prove your citizenship merely to participate in an election, a democratic process you have engaged in freely for your entire adult life. This sudden requirement is not born out of anything you personally did wrong. It is not the result of any criminal charge, nor is it tied to any formal investigation associated with your name. Rather, it is happening simply because the government insists that there is a severe, unprecedented crisis. They claim there is an invisible, widespread, and catastrophic threat of non-citizens casting fraudulent ballots. This alleged crisis is supposedly so severe that it entirely justifies completely rewriting the fundamental rules of how 330 million people access their most basic foundational right within a constitutional democracy. Now, take a moment to imagine the single individual who is directly responsible for investigating that exact federal crime. Imagine the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation sitting under oath before a congressional committee, completely unable to state exactly how many individuals have actually been convicted of this specific crime. This is not a number that is highly classified. It is not sensitive intelligence hidden behind a wall of national security. It is simply glaringly unknown. What you are witnessing is not a routine, procedural congressional hearing. This is a vivid, real-time demonstration of what it looks like when sweeping national legislation is constructed first, with the desperate expectation that the justifying evidence will somehow magically appear later. This is exactly what it looks like when a massive national policy is forcefully justified by a specific number that absolutely no one in a position of power can actually produce on demand. And this profound unraveling happened directly inside the House Intelligence Committee chamber, precisely when Congressman Mike Quigley looked at Kash Patel and asked a question that required only one simple thing: a number. The question was remarkably straightforward. So deceptively simple, it almost blended into the ambient noise of the congressional chamber. There was no intricate legal labyrinth to navigate or multi-page intelligence briefing required. It was a direct, unyielding line drawn between a national political claim and the basic legal proof required to sustain it. How many non-citizens have actually been convicted for voting in United States elections? That question carried immense weight because of the intense political maneuvering occurring outside the hearing room. For 3 months, the Republican House majority had aggressively advanced the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, or SAVE Act. This monumental bill sought to alter electoral mechanics nationwide by federally requiring strict documentary proof of citizenship for all voter registrations. This massive shift would be layered on pre-existing verification systems that already mandate identity checks, residency confirmations, and legal attestations signed under penalty of perjury. The public justification for this shift was broadcasted loudly from political podiums and cable news interviews. The prevailing narrative insisted non-citizen voting was a critically underreported crisis threatening American elections. The political stakes were not theoretical. The president explicitly tied the fate of the entire Senate legislative calendar to this overarching narrative, making it clear no other legislation would move forward until the SAVE Act passed. Funding priorities and essential domestic programs were completely stalled behind this foundational premise. However, that premise demanded solid, empirical evidence. If a government intends to impose a nationwide requirement that every single voter must prove their citizenship with physical documentation, it needs significantly more than fiery political rhetoric. You need actual legal cases, documented behavioral patterns, and hard, quantifiable numbers demonstrating the scale of the alleged problem. You need something tangible that transforms a vague political suspicion into undeniable proof. That is exactly where the FBI enters the picture. The FBI is not a public relations agency validating campaign slogans. It is the premier federal investigative body responsible for gathering hard evidence and producing prosecutions that transform into convictions recorded by the Department of Justice. If there truly is a systemic criminal phenomenon affecting national elections, the FBI is where that invisible phenomenon becomes measurable. Sitting in the witness chair was Kash Patel, the director of the FBI. He should have had that specific number memorized, especially since his agency would be tasked with enforcing the very law pushed through Congress. Congressman Mike Quigley understood what that dynamic meant. He had been quietly watching the high-stakes hearing unfold for nearly 2 hours, carefully observing how the director's answers were constructed. He watched as specific factual commitments were skillfully avoided, and witnesses smoothly pivoted away from hard data to speak in sweeping generalizations. He listened to lengthy answers that sounded complete to the untrained ear, but actually contained absolutely zero measurable substance upon closer inspection. When his turn finally arrived, Quigley did not bring a theatrical reveal. He simply brought a cold calculation. If the active FBI director cannot say how many non-citizens have been successfully convicted of voting, then every public claim regarding the scale of that threat exists entirely without a quantifiable foundation. If the director cannot state how many active federal investigations are underway, the intense political urgency attached to that threat becomes impossible to verify independently. If both glaring absences are true, the federal legislation built on top of that threat is operating in a total factual vacuum. With that intellectual framework in mind, Quigley calmly asked, "Director, how many non-citizens have been convicted for voting in United States elections?" Kash Patel's answer came back surprisingly quickly. He stated that official conviction statistics are kept with the Department of Justice. That brief sentence brilliantly attempts to accomplish two things simultaneously. On the surface, it is technically correct. The DOJ maintains official conviction records, but what that sentence deliberately omits is infinitely more important. It does not answer the core question, nor does it provide a solid number. Instead, it subtly shifts ultimate responsibility far away from the person whose investigative agency generates the complex cases directly leading to those eventual convictions. Quigley, however, was far too experienced to let that bureaucratic deflection stand unchallenged. He narrowed the scope immediately, removing Patel's convenient escape route. He calmly acknowledged his understanding that the DOJ keeps the official records. But then he sharpened his focus, stating clearly, "I am asking you, as the sitting FBI director, whether you personally know the number." The question was no longer a trivial matter of administrative record-keeping. It was fundamentally about executive knowledge, professional preparedness, and accountability. This hearing was scheduled 3 full weeks in advance. Briefing books were prepared, teams assembled, and the issue of non-citizen voting was arguably the most important domestic law enforcement claim used to justify sweeping federal legislation. When Director Patel finally admitted, "I do not have that number with me," the glaring absence became undeniably visible. Quigley pressed him again, expanding the implication of the director's failure. "You prepared for this hearing," Quigley stated as a documented fact. "Your staff prepared extensive briefing books for this specific hearing. This issue has been positioned at the absolute center of the national legislative agenda for 3 months." Then, Quigley drew the final line that officially turned a minor mistake into a catastrophic evidentiary problem. "And yet, you came here today without knowing exactly how many people have been convicted of the very crime that this legislation was written to prevent. That is not cheap political rhetoric. That is architectural debate structure. That is exactly how you expertly build intense pressure in a congressional hearing without ever needing to raise your voice." And immediately after sealing that trap, Quigley smoothly asked his second question, "Can you tell me exactly how many active FBI investigations there are right now into non-citizen voting?" This is where the evidentiary gap violently widens, because even if an agency director does not perfectly recall final conviction totals managed by a separate department, you would logically, reasonably expect the head of the investigative arm to actually know how many major federal cases his own agency is currently actively pursuing. Patel's answer to this was equally evasive. He stated that the FBI has a number of investigations, generally speaking, ongoing about various individuals across the country. He quickly added that he did not have that exact number with him, but he assured the committee that he had a number of them. A number. Not the number, but a number. Quigley repeated the vague phrase back to him. He did not do it with heavy sarcasm. He did not do it with performative outrage. He did it with surgical precision. "A number," he said calmly. "You have a number of ongoing investigations, but you absolutely cannot say how many." And right there, the rhetorical structure is complete. First, there is absolutely no conviction number. Second, there is absolutely no active investigation number. What currently remains on the table is nothing more than pure political assertion existing entirely without any form of empirical measurement. This is the precise moment where the hearing violently shifts into full prosecutorial mode. Because Quigley does something absolutely critical next. He deliberately introduces an external, highly credible data set, not just to win a temporary argument, but to firmly define the factual baseline of reality. He picks up a single printed page from his desk. This document is not sourced from a liberal democratic think tank. It is not provided by a voting rights advocacy group ideologically aligned with his own party. It is directly from the Heritage Foundation, a deeply conservative think tank. This is an organization whose extensive research has been used repeatedly and enthusiastically to support conservative election integrity arguments for decades. It is an institution fundamentally aligned in many critical ways with the broader policy direction currently being advanced by the majority. Quigley holds the single piece of paper up just long enough for the television cameras to clearly register the official header. According to their own data, Quigley states with absolute calm, there have been exactly 77 documented cases of non-citizen voting in the United States over the past 24 years. 77. Not 77,000. Not even 700. Exactly 77 isolated cases spread across nearly a quarter of a century, occurring in a massive country populated by hundreds of millions of people, where literally billions of individual ballots have been legally cast over that exact same time frame. Mathematically, that averages out to roughly 3 individual cases per year nationwide. And now, the glaring political contrast becomes entirely unavoidable. On one side of the scale, there is a massive, forceful legislative push, strong enough to completely halt the entire United States Senate calendar, furiously justified by terrifying claims of a massive, underreported national crisis. On the other side of the scale, there sits the most comprehensive, detailed data set ever produced by a leading conservative institution, painstakingly documenting fewer than 100 actual cases in 24 years. Quigley does not editorialize the data. He does not exaggerate the findings. He simply places the concrete number firmly into the official congressional record. And then, he asks the ultimate question that forcefully turns the data into a brutal test of professional credibility. Do you believe the Heritage Foundation number is accurate? This is the critical moment where Director Patel has 3 distinct options available to him. He can agree with the conservative number. He can firmly dispute the number by providing a higher, verified number from his own agency. Or, he can simply decline to assess the data entirely. Instead, he stubbornly chooses a disastrous fourth path. I believe that estimation to be low, Patel responds. That single sentence is the absolute pivot point of the entire hearing. Because now, we have something entirely new introduced into the record. We do not have a number. We do not have data. We simply have an opinion about the scale of a crime. He believes the number is low. He feels it is lower than 77, lower than 3 cases per year. But crucially, he absolutely cannot say exactly how low. He cannot provide an alternative, factual figure to replace it. He cannot clearly define the actual range of the threat. He cannot point to a single, verified dataset that effectively contradicts the one sitting right in front of him. So, what actually exists in that congressional room in that specific moment is not evidence. It is a massive, gaping, factual void, filled entirely by personal belief. And that is exactly where the entire towering structure of the massive legislative argument begins to violently strain and crack. Because sweeping national legislation of this immense magnitude absolutely does not rest on personal belief. It must rest on undeniable proof, and the single person most directly responsible for actively generating that proof has just openly told the United States Congress that he literally does not have the number. Once that vital distinction is publicly exposed, once the room collectively understands that what is being aggressively offered is not hard data but merely unverified belief, the entire foundational logic of the sweeping policy begins to tilt dangerously under its own massive weight. Because a strongly held belief can certainly justify a catchy political talking point, but it absolutely cannot justify a strict, nationwide legal requirement forced upon every single eligible voter in the entire country, not without violently crossing a sacred line that fundamentally separates lawful enforcement from wild assumption. Quigley does not rush this profound realization. He lets it sit heavily in the room. He deliberately lets the words, "I believe that estimation is low," hang suspended in the silent air just long enough for their terrifying implications to fully settle into the minds of the audience. Because what has just been openly admitted under oath is not mere statistical uncertainty. It is something significantly more unstable and dangerous. It is supreme confidence existing entirely without a measurable, factual foundation. And in a congressional hearing room, confidence without measurement is not a display of strength. It is a massive vulnerability. This is exactly where the questioning turns much sharper. It does not become louder, but it becomes infinitely more exact. Quigley is no longer trying to forcefully extract a hidden number from the director. He is now actively demonstrating the terrifying absence of one. He is meticulously building an undeniable public record that clearly shows not just what Patel knows, but exactly what he does not know, and what he continues to boldly claim anyway, despite that ignorance. The rhetorical structure becomes almost clinical at this stage. Each logical step perfectly reinforces the last, with each evasive answer continually narrowing the remaining space Patel has left to maneuver. Because every single time the director reaches for broad, general language to escape the pressure, Quigley smoothly brings the focus right back to hard specifics. And every time Patel desperately leans on vague, institutional phrasing to shield himself, Quigley ruthlessly strips it down to demand individual accountability. "You believe the number is low," Quigley repeats calmly. He does not say it as a challenge, but rather as a formalized statement of fact that now permanently belongs to the congressional record. And then he seamlessly adds the critical missing piece, the exact piece that transforms that unverified belief into a massive systemic problem. "But you cannot tell us what the actual number is." That is the true, glaring contradiction at the heart of the matter. It is not a contradiction between warring political parties. It is not a contradiction between opposing ideologies. It is a fundamental contradiction between loud assertion and actual evidence, because in any serious investigative framework, especially one that eventually leads to severe federal prosecution, scale matters deeply. It does not matter in the theoretical abstract. It matters in concrete, measurable terms. These are the strict terms that dictate vital resource allocation, determine national enforcement priority, establish legislative necessity, and ultimately justify the heavy bureaucratic burden placed directly on the American public. If a national threat is truly widespread and systemic, it rightfully demands a massive, systemic governmental response. But if it is exceedingly rare, it demands surgical precision, not massive, sweeping expansion. And what is now sitting completely exposed in the middle of this high-stakes hearing is a loud, terrifying claim of a widespread national threat accompanied by absolutely no defined scale, no documented range, and no quantifiable factual baseline from the very federal agency explicitly tasked with defining it. Quigley does something incredibly subtle next. He executes a maneuver that brilliantly shifts the entire conversation from a single, isolated question to a much broader, systemic evidentiary framework. He connects this precise moment of failure to something that had already been firmly established much earlier in the hearing, something that, on its surface, seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with domestic American voting: Russia. Earlier in the day, Patel, alongside several other high-ranking intelligence officials, had been directly asked whether the United States intelligence community takes foreign adversaries simply at their word. This was specifically asked in the context of Russia aggressively denying that it had provided targeting intelligence to Iranian military forces. The official answer provided had been incredibly clear, highly consistent, and totally unambiguous: no. It is a foundational, unbreakable tenet of all intelligence operations absolutely not to take foreign adversaries at their word. That core principle is not optional. It is foundational to national survival. You verify. You strictly corroborate. You absolutely do not accept sweeping claims without hard evidence, especially when those claims carry massive, irreversible strategic consequences. Quigley smoothly brings that established principle right back into the room. But now, he turns that exact same rigorous standard inward, pointing it directly toward domestic American policy. He points it toward the massive claims being aggressively made not by hostile foreign adversaries, but by the American administration itself. "Director," he says, his tone still perfectly measured and completely controlled, "you said earlier that it is a fundamental tenet of intelligence operations not to take foreign adversaries at their word." He pauses just long enough to firmly anchor that previous statement in the present record. "Is it also a tenet of FBI operations not to build massive legislative priorities around claims you absolutely cannot verify?" That is not a cheap rhetorical flourish. That is a direct, devastating application of the agency's very own operational standard. Because if you refuse to take a hostile adversary's denial at face value without seeing the hard evidence, then logically, you absolutely should not take your own side's massive political assertion at face value without seeing the hard evidence either, especially not when that unverified assertion is currently being weaponized to justify a massive structural change to how free elections operate for hundreds of millions of people. Patel's nervous response quickly retreats back into safe, familiar territory. He hides behind the vague language of large institutions rather than addressing the demand for hard numbers. He states that the FBI supports its critical law enforcement mission with the best available evidence, and that their ongoing investigative work speaks for itself regarding the true scope of any relevant threat. It sounds like a complete sentence. It sounds highly authoritative, but if you listen carefully to what it actually contains, it is entirely hollow. There is no number. There is no estimate. There is no acknowledgement of the Heritage Foundation's 77 cases. There is absolutely no contradiction of that tiny number with a superior, alternative data set. It is just a desperate, empty return to bureaucratic process. Quigley does not interrupt the director. He does not loudly argue with him. He does not escalate the emotional tension. He simply acts as a clinical translator. The best available evidence, he says clearly, is 77 cases in 24 years, drawn directly from the most thorough, respected database the conservative movement has ever produced. And then, he places Patel's empty statement right next to that hard fact, and the FBI director believes that number is low, but absolutely cannot say what the correct number actually is. This is the masterful technique of evidence stacking. It is not about endlessly adding new facts to confuse the witness, but about perfectly aligning the existing facts until the glaring gap between them becomes completely impossible for anyone to ignore. On one side, there is a meticulously documented historical data set. On the other side, there is nothing but an unsupported, politically convenient belief, and hanging directly between those two completely different realities is a sweeping piece of federal legislation that would forcefully require every single American citizen to produce strict documentary proof of citizenship just to register to vote. This is exactly where the hearing stops being about one isolated exchange between two men and evolves into something vastly broader and more structural. Because what is now on full, glaring display is not just a temporary gap in an official's knowledge. It is a massive, terrifying gap in legal justification. And that specific gap carries severe consequences that extend far beyond the paneled walls of that room. Think deeply about what that proposed legal requirement actually means in practical, everyday terms. It means that individual citizens who have legally and faithfully voted in their communities for decades could suddenly be asked to produce specific documents they may not have readily available in a drawer. It means that underfunded, overwhelmed local administrative systems would suddenly need to carefully process, scan, and legally verify millions of those documents at an unprecedented scale. It means inevitable delays, wrongful rejections, clerical errors, and massive bureaucratic barriers that simply did not previously exist. And absolutely all of that massive societal friction is being justified by a supposed threat that, according to the absolute only number officially placed on the table so far, amounts to an average of just 3 isolated cases per year nationwide. This is the profound moral contrast sitting at the very center of the moment. On one side, millions upon millions of completely lawful voters are being heavily burdened and asked to prove their eligibility in difficult new ways. On the other side, there exists a mere handful of documented, verified violations spread thinly over multiple decades. And the single person officially tasked with bridging that massive logical gap with hard evidence absolutely cannot provide it. Quigley leans heavily into that moral contrast, but he completely refuses to dramatize it. He does not need to manufacture drama because the stark facts are already doing all the heavy lifting. He physically places 2 distinct documents side by side on the wooden table: the detailed Heritage Foundation analysis and the sweeping legislative citation, visually and physically aligning the massive political claim right next to the glaringly inadequate justification. And then, he asks the final question that pulls everything perfectly together. Should Congress truly take the administration's word about the massive scale of non-citizen voting entirely without evidence, he asks, when the FBI director himself cannot even provide the basic number? That devastating question is not just meant for Kash Patel. It is directed at every single elected member of Congress sitting in that room. It is for every single senator who is currently preparing to vote on the bill. It is for every single American viewer watching at home. desperately trying to understand exactly what is being asked of them and precisely what evidence justifies that demand. And what follows that question is absolutely not an answer. It is pure, unfiltered avoidance. Tulsi Gabbard, sitting directly beside Patel, immediately shifts the conversation to broad, meaningless generalities about election integrity always being a top national priority. Patel simply reiterates his earlier talking point, claiming that the FBI's ongoing, silent work speaks for itself. But once again, listen closely to what is tragically missing from their responses. There is no hard number. There is no factual clarification. There is no data correction. It is just the endless reinforcement of the exact same deeply flawed pattern. Loud assertion completely devoid of empirical measurement. Quigley does not press the issue any further. He stops, not because there is nothing left to ask the witnesses, but because he knows there is absolutely nothing left to extract from them. The glaring absence of data has already been fully, publicly demonstrated. The official record has already been solidly built. Pushing any further would not miraculously produce new, hidden information. It would only result in repeating the exact same frustrating evasion. So instead, he does something infinitely more powerful for the historical record. He summarizes the entirety of the failure. "Let me put this firmly in the record," he says. And that specific phrasing matters immensely, because this is no longer a fluid conversation. It is now formal, permanent documentation. The president is actively blocking all Senate legislation until this specific bill passes, he states clearly. He has been constantly claiming that our elections are currently plagued by millions of foreign voters. Yet, the FBI director sitting here cannot say how many non-citizens have actually been convicted. He cannot say how many federal investigations are currently active, and he simply believes that the most thorough conservative database in existence is somehow low, entirely without providing any alternative number to prove it. Each line he speaks is a documented receipt. Each line is highly verifiable within the strict context of the hearing and the broader, chaotic political moment. And when he finally finishes his summary, he does not look back down at Patel. He looks directly at the television cameras, because at that pivotal point, the audience that truly matters is no longer sitting inside the hearing room. The United States Senate is voting on this exact issue today, he says with total clarity. The American people are fundamentally entitled to know that this complete lack of data is the actual evidence base for what they are currently being asked to accept. That is the brilliant, devastating closing argument for this entire segment of the hearing. It is not highly emotional. It is not overly theatrical. It is just perfectly structured logic, and outside the walls of that room, the public reaction begins almost immediately. The hard number 77 cases in 24 years starts appearing everywhere. It flashes on news screens, highlights in sharp graphics, and dominates bold headline. Because the number is incredibly simple, it is highly concrete, and it stands in direct, embarrassing contrast to the massive, apocalyptic scale of the claims being made by politicians. The viral video clip of Patel awkwardly saying, "I have a number of investigations, but I don't have that number with me," begins to circulate wildly across social media. It goes viral not because it is overly dramatic or sensationalized, but because it is incredibly clear. Absolute clarity travels fast. And in quiet Senate offices on both sides of the political aisle, the exact same fundamental question begins to rapidly surface. They don't ask it in the formal language of committee hearings, but in the practical, everyday language of regular voters. If this tiny number represents the actual threat, why do we need this massive, disruptive law? Because that is exactly what this congressional moment ultimately creates. It does not create a neat, tidy conclusion, but rather a glaring, massive question that simply cannot be easily dismissed by political spin. If the electoral crisis is genuinely real, show the public the number. If the number absolutely cannot be shown by the top authorities, then what exactly is being used to justify this massive national response? And even more importantly, who ultimately carries the heavy, daily burden of that political uncertainty? And that vital question absolutely does not stay neatly confined to the wood-paneled hearing room. It does not remain buried as a forgotten line in a massive congressional transcript, or as a fleeting clip on a 2-4-hour news segment. It rapidly expands outward into something far more consequential for the entire nation. Because once a government formally asks its citizens to blindly accept new legal burdens, strict new requirements, and complex new layers of bureaucratic verification, the factual justification for those new burdens instantly becomes a massive public obligation, not merely a private, untested assumption held by a few politicians. You absolutely do not get to impose massive administrative friction on a foundational constitutional right based purely on a vague, emotional belief that you cannot mathematically quantify. You cannot do that without severely eroding something much deeper and more vital than any single policy. You cannot do that without directly damaging the fragile foundation of public trust that allows the entire democratic system to function in the first place. Because voting is absolutely not some abstract, philosophical concept. It is not a theoretical, invisible mechanism. It is a real, lived action carried out by hundreds of millions of regular people who completely rely on the system to be both highly accessible and fundamentally fair. And when that complex system suddenly changes, when strict new legal barriers are suddenly introduced, the negative impact is absolutely not distributed evenly across the population. The heavy burden inevitably falls hardest on those with the absolute least flexibility in their daily lives, the least access to perfect historical documentation, and the absolute least margin for bureaucratic error. That is not wild political speculation. That is simply how massive administrative systems always behave in reality. When they expand their strict requirements, they inevitably create new thresholds, and rigid thresholds always inevitably exclude someone from participating. So the fundamental question sitting at the absolute center of this viral moment is no longer just about Kash Patel's memory, or Mike Quigley's questioning skills, or even the SAVE Act itself. It is fundamentally about the required standard of evidence before you permanently alter the basic conditions under which free citizens exercise their constitutional rights. And what Congressman Quigley exposed, methodically and entirely without cheap theatrics, is that the standard of evidence being applied here absolutely does not match the rigorous standard the government proudly claims to uphold in absolutely every other serious domain. Because earlier in that very same hearing, when the topic was foreign intelligence gathering, the standard was incredibly clear, almost rigid in its absolute clarity. You absolutely do not accept claims without strict verification. You do not build massive conclusions on untested, wild assertions. You simply do not take an adversary at their word when the national stakes are incredibly high. That core principle is absolutely not optional. It is deeply embedded in exactly how serious intelligence work is conducted every single day. It is repeated, rigorously trained, and strictly enforced. And yet, when the political conversation shifts from fighting foreign threats to implementing domestic policy, that rigorous standard suddenly appears to loosen entirely. It bends to accommodate something vastly less concrete. It accommodates a policy that relies not on hard, documented evidence, but simply on loud, repeated political assertion. That is the glaring inconsistency that Quigley forces out into the open air. He does not do it by angrily accusing them. He does it simply by aligning their own statements next to each other until they completely contradict themselves on their own merits. On one hand, there is a total refusal to trust unverified claims from foreign adversaries. On the other hand, there is a total willingness to blindly advance unverified claims as the sole basis for sweeping national legislation. That is not merely a partisan political contradiction. It is a fatal, logical one. And once that massive flaw is made entirely visible to the public, it becomes incredibly difficult to simply ignore, because it raises a profound question that goes far beyond this specific voting issue and cuts deeply into the fundamental structure of democratic governance itself. What exactly is the threshold of hard proof required before the government is allowed to impose strict new conditions on its citizens? Not in academic theory, but in daily practice. Because right here, in this specific hearing, the threshold appears to have tragically shifted from demanding hard evidence to accepting vague inference, from relying on solid data to trusting blind belief, from examining quantifiable facts to reacting to generalized political concern. And that dangerous shift has massive, real-world consequences. It means that the heavy burden of uncertainty absolutely does not stay with the government. Instead, it is unfairly transferred directly to the public. It is completely absorbed by the individual, everyday voter who now suddenly has to navigate complex additional requirements, track down additional historical documentation, and survive additional bureaucratic scrutiny, all of which is heavily justified by a supposed threat that has absolutely not been clearly defined in any measurable terms by the authorities. That is the profound moral imbalance sitting at the absolute center of this viral moment. The government is being allowed to operate freely on an entirely undefined scale of theoretical risk, while the ordinary citizen is suddenly required to operate under strictly defined, harshly enforced conditions of absolute compliance. One side deals entirely in vague approximation, while the other side deals exclusively in strict, demanding proof. And that massive, glaring asymmetry is simply not sustainable if the democratic system is expected to maintain its public legitimacy. Because institutional legitimacy absolutely does not come from raw authority alone. It comes directly from consistency. It comes from the fair application of high standards that do not suddenly change depending on exactly who is making the claim or exactly who is being negatively affected by it. If hard evidence is strictly required to verify a foreign threat, it absolutely should be strictly required to justify a massive domestic policy. If precise numbers are considered entirely necessary to assess risk abroad, they absolutely should be considered necessary to assess risk at home. Otherwise, the vital distinction between objective analysis and political narrative begins to dangerously blur. And once that critical line blurs, public trust immediately begins to deeply erode. It does not erode all at once. It does not vanish in a single, explosive moment. But it erodes gradually, through repeated, frustrating instances where the public is aggressively asked to accept massive conclusions that are absolutely not fully supported by visible, solid evidence. That is exactly what makes this specific hearing so profoundly significant. Not because it magically produces a definitive, satisfying answer, but precisely because it brilliantly exposes the complete absence of one at a highly critical point in the national decision-making process. And in brilliantly doing so, it forces the heavy burden back exactly where it rightfully belongs, back onto the political claim itself, back onto the politicians aggressively advancing it, and back onto the single, vital question that still has not been answered by anyone. How many? Because absolutely everything hinges entirely on that specific number. The true scale of the alleged threat, the actual necessity of the massive response, and the legal proportionality of the proposed law all depend on it. Without that concrete number, the entire towering legislative structure rests precariously on a flimsy assumption that has absolutely not been verified in the exact way the government itself strictly defines verification in every other serious context. And that is absolutely not a small administrative oversight. That is a massive, foundational gap in logic. You can clearly see that gap in the exact way the official answers are desperately constructed. You can hear it in the heavy reliance on vague phrases like ongoing investigations and best available evidence. That is carefully crafted language that safely signals bureaucratic activity without ever specifying the actual scope, implies immense effort without ever defining the final outcome, and suggests forward motion without ever providing a concrete measurement. Those practiced phrases are certainly not meaningless, but they are entirely incomplete. And when they are frequently used in place of concrete, hard data, they function less as real answers and more as empty placeholders, temporary rhetorical structures desperately filling a void where something much more definitive and truthful is expected by the public. Congressman Quigley perfectly recognizes that tactic, and he does not waste time trying to angrily dismantle those empty placeholders directly. He simply quietly contrasts them with what absolutely should be sitting there instead: a hard number, a verified range, a highly documented statistical figure that firmly anchors the entire national discussion in something completely tangible. And when that vital factual anchor is clearly missing, absolutely everything else begins to dangerously drift. The political claim drifts, the legal justification drifts, and the massive policy built precariously on top of it drifts, until what ultimately remains is not a solid, reliable foundation, but merely a flimsy framework suspended terrifyingly over a massive evidentiary gap. This is precisely where the congressional hearing transforms from a moment of sharp political analysis into an event with profound national implications. Once that massive factual gap is successfully identified, observers are forced to ask exactly what is filling the void. Is it mere political assumption, intense partisan pressure, or a powerful viral narrative that has gained massive momentum without ever being fully tested against available hard data? Congressman Quigley completely refuses to answer that question directly for the audience. Instead, he does something vastly more effective by leaving the question wide open, perfectly documented, and firmly attached to specific statements and glaring omissions, allowing anyone objectively examining the official record to easily trace the flawed logic for themselves. That dynamic is exactly what makes the moment so durable and deeply damaging. It is absolutely not dependent on subjective partisan interpretation because it is built entirely on what was explicitly said under oath and what was glaringly omitted. The absence of data is not merely implied, it is clearly and undeniably demonstrated. The director of the FBI absolutely did not provide a specific number, a rough estimate, or even a broad statistical range. He only provided a personal belief. That completely unverified belief is now a permanent part of the congressional record, directly attached to a massive legislative push that aggressively demands one of the most significant, disruptive changes to voter registration requirements in an entire generation. That direct connection is what ultimately elevates this encounter from a dry, procedural exchange into a massive, substantive issue. It perfectly ties the flawed internal logic of a committee hearing directly to the massive external consequences of a national policy decision. It inextricably links empty words to binding action, unverified statements to strict laws, and personal beliefs to severe requirements imposed forcefully on millions of regular people. Once that direct link is firmly established, it becomes absolutely impossible to treat the hearing as just an isolated, forgettable event. It becomes a critical part of the long evidentiary chain that heavily informs exactly how the American public evaluates the fundamental legitimacy of the law itself. When ordinary people are suddenly asked to comply with complex new rules, they naturally look for the solid, logical justification that explains exactly why those strict rules exist. If that factual justification remains unclear, and if the true scale is not mathematically measurable, compliance suddenly becomes forced obligation without understanding and blind acceptance without clarity. Over time, that kind of blind acceptance becomes incredibly difficult to sustain, not because people inherently resist all rules, but because they rightfully question strict rules that do not appear grounded in verifiable evidence. This reveals a dangerous, repeating pattern where sweeping legislation aggressively advances, while the hard data that supposedly justifies it remains entirely unavailable. The heavy burden of proof subtly shifts away from the powerful government and lands squarely onto the shoulders of the public. Once that dangerous pattern is made entirely visible, it invites a final, completely unavoidable question. If the government absolutely cannot quantify the massive crisis it is forcefully asking you to accept, what exactly are you truly being asked to believe? This is no longer just a story about whether the FBI director simply forgot a number. It is a profound story about exactly what happens when a powerful government aggressively advances a massive policy that severely affects millions of people, while the actual scale of the problem remains completely undefined at the highest level of federal enforcement. There is a fundamental difference between not having the exact figure sitting in front of you and being completely unable to establish even the basic range of the problem. One is a minor lapse. The other is a catastrophic structural weakness. What Congressman Quigley brilliantly exposed was the terrifying absence of a measurable boundary, without which threat descriptions become wildly broader, legal justifications become dangerously flexible, and bureaucratic requirements become increasingly invasive. In absolutely any other serious domain, whether criminal law, foreign intelligence, or national security, you do not escalate your massive response without first firmly establishing the scale, nor do you impose severe burdens without demonstrating absolute necessity. Yet here, the logical order is completely reversed. The heavy burden comes first, the flimsy justification follows, and the actual measurement is endlessly deferred. When aggressive legislation outpaces solid proof, the societal cost lands heavily on specific individuals who must navigate confusing documents and flawed verification systems, where a minor mismatch rapidly morphs into complete democratic exclusion. This massive friction enters the system through a fundamentally flawed, poorly designed legal structure built precariously upon an unverified scale of risk. Crucially, massive gaps like this do not remain neatly contained inside congressional committee hearings. They permanently attach themselves to the proposed legislation. Every senator who ultimately votes for this flawed bill carries that glaring factual void directly into their political justification. Any public defense of the sweeping policy must now awkwardly attempt to explain why empirical data is somehow unnecessary, because eventually, someone will inevitably ask the exact same question again in crowded town halls and live television interviews. How many? Outside the rigid structure of a formal hearing, there are no convenient procedural exits. There is only the direct, unyielding public expectation that massive claims are supported by concrete facts. Ultimately, Congressman Quigley did not need to actively disprove the entire narrative. He only needed to firmly establish on the official record that the single person most responsible for quantifying the threat absolutely could not do it. That glaring failure permanently shifts the burden of proof back to the politicians advancing the claim. The ultimate question remains devastatingly unanswered. If a new law demands strict proof from every citizen, what exact proof exists to justify that demand?